to rouse the.
Sorry,
Is there
Rodney.
something going wrong here?
No, it's all good. You carry on.
Oh, okay. Because I'm just getting this tiny little picture. In any event, that no one had done more than me to make people aware of Bomber Command, what it really was and what it really did. And so that's why the British, well, they did two things. They made me the only honorary ambassador they've got for Bomber Command, and they made me a full member of the Royal Air Force Club as well, because of the importance they attach to my work. Now, I think I was accidentally introduced initially as Rodney, which, as you know, is an English name. I'm actually a Mackenzie. I'm Scottish. You notice my Mackenzie tartan that I'm wearing. And if you get tired of looking at me, you can see Ellendon Castle in the background. That is the most photographed castle in Europe. It was the first of Clan Mackenzie's 12 castles, and it's always a lovely, lovely castle to look at. So, having said that, start with my book, Bomber Command. It's got a New Zealand bomber on the front of it because Bomber Command was 4 countries, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom. And if you look at the back of it, it says in big letters there by Peter Mansbridge, this is what Peter Mansbridge says: Bomber Command is a tour de force. It's simply a masterpiece of reflection, anecdotes, and history. There's so much here I didn't know, and I thought I knew a lot. Future generations will read this book as they bloody well should. That was Peter Mansbridge. And here I've also got an inspiring Lancaster for anybody that doesn't know what they look like. They were our biggest plane in the war, and they were absolutely decisive to the victory that we ultimately enjoyed. First, to understand Bomber Command, to understand Canada's role in the war as an independent nation, and to understand the Air Force, you have to first understand the prime ministers. The British Prime Minister, Sir Winston Churchill, and Canadian Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King, who of course is on our $50 bill. Mackenzie King became Prime Minister in 1921, and other than a brief interval during the Great Depression, he was still Prime Minister until his resignation in November of 1948. 1921 to 1948, and he brought our country from being really almost just a colony into a world respected nation, which at the end of the war had the world's 4th largest air force, which was an accomplishment because we had more Canadians flying, like my father, seconded to the Royal Air Force than we had in our own Air Force. And yet we still had the 4th largest, we had the 3rd largest Navy in the world, and we had the 4th largest industrial economy on the planet at the end of World War II. So Churchill and Mackenzie King, they're only 18 days apart in age. Churchill was born in Blenheim Palace on the 30th of November of 1874, and William Lyon Mackenzie King was born in Berlin, Ontario, which is now Kitchener, Ontario, on the 17th of December. So they're only 18 days apart. They first met in 1900, November of 1900, when Churchill came to talk about the Boer War because he needed money. His total salary as an imperial officer in the Imperial Army was £50 a year, but his bar bill was £200 a year, and so there was a shortage of cash. So he was here to talk about his exploits, and that's when they first met. Their first meeting was not a success. The second meeting was in London, and in London, Churchill said to Mackenzie King, "When we met in Canada, I think that I made a frightful ass of myself." To which Mackenzie King replied, "Well, Mr. Churchill, a great many Canadians would agree with you, and I'm one of them." Well, that launched one of the great friendships of the 20th century. It was 40 years later, in May of 1940, when Churchill became the Prime Minister. They had known each other for 40 years. Every time Mackenzie King was in England, he saw Churchill. Every time Churchill was in Canada, he saw Mackenzie King. And in his darkest days, when Churchill came here in 1929, he'd lost the election, he'd lost his office, he'd even lost his appendix. He came here with his son Jack, plus his brother and his nephew. The 4 of them came to Canada, and Mackenzie King entertained them up in the Gatineau Hills in Kingsmere, and did a lot to restore Churchill's sense of importance and At any rate, it was an extraordinary relationship. So when he became prime minister in 1940, a month later, the French surrendered. Canada was now the biggest ally they had. And the only functioning army in the United Kingdom was the 1st Canadian Army, because the British had left all of their stuff on the beaches of Dunkirk. So we were indispensable to the British. Our Navy played the decisive role in the Battle of the Atlantic. Our Army was the only army in Britain at that time. And then there's the Air Force. One thing that Churchill and Mackenzie King were in agreement on is that we had to control the air. They were of one mind on that. Now, one of the most famous speeches Churchill ever gave was about the few, we owe so much to the few, and most people think that that's just fighter pilots, but that wasn't true at all. It was a statement in Parliament, and there were 2 sentences. And the second sentence was all about Bomber Command. That's what he was really talking about. And of course, he also said, the fighters are our salvation, but the bombers alone provide the means of victory. And so that got us into the strategic bombing offensive, which was one of the 2 greatest battles of the Second World War. The other was the Battle of the Atlantic. Royal Canadian Navy played an enormous role in the Battle of the Atlantic. It was from the first day till the last of the war, and we played an enormous role in the strategic bombing offensive, which began on the first day of the war and went through to the last day of the war. One of the controversial parts of the strategic bombing offensive was the leader of Bomber Command, Sir Arthur Harris. And I must say that in my research, pretty much everything written and said about Sir Arthur Harris is wrong. The reality is he's one of Churchill's most effective military leaders. In the words of President Dwight Eisenhower, Harris accomplished the impossible in Bomber Command. Now, the cost was overwhelming. I'm going to say it again. 1 out of every 4 Canadians killed in that war was killed in Bomber Command. That's true with the British as well. 1 out of every 4 British were killed in Bomber Command. And the Australians, 1 out of every 5 Australians that died in World War II died in Bomber Command. My dad was seconded to 166 Squadron of the Royal Air Force. It was the original bomber squadron back in 1918. It flew for 27 months in World War II and had 944 men killed, average age 23, and of these 944 that were killed, 155 were Canadians. Now, to wipe out a squadron of 24 Lancasters such that you're killing 944 men, you have to destroy the entire squadron 5.5 times. And that's what happened in those 27 months. The entire squadron was killed 5.5 times. My dad started flying on the 1st of April, 1944. In March of 1944, 166 Squadron lost 45% of the entire squadron. Post-war, Bomber Command's been either defamed or forgotten. And the main reason is the Allies never really knew what it accomplished. So it was really easy to attack, and nobody really came to its defense. To remedy this, I turned to the Germans. As John was saying in the introduction, they know exactly what we accomplished. And they say that these enormous casualties were not in vain. The Germans say Bomber Command was vital to victory. I was first awakened to all of this when I was in the Pentagon in February of 2018. There something incredible happened. A group of United States Air Force officers told me Bomber Command had the finest air crew of any Air Force anywhere in the world ever. Your dad, Roddy, flew with the best of the best. These are Americans, highest ranking Americans, and they're saying that Bomber Command was the best of the best. That started to arouse my curiosity as to what happened. And then I was dragged into a special remembrance of 166 Squadron, and my sons who live in London, Roddy MacKenzie and Roddy MacKenzie, the 3 of us were part of this huge ceremony for 166 Squadron. I didn't even know what squadron my dad was in until about 2018. He died in 1991. All I knew from my dad was he piloted a Lancaster that dropped bombs. That was it. And so once I had 166 Squadron in my sights, they got me involved. And we went to this ceremony. It was a whole day, 9 in the morning till 5 in the afternoon. There were hundreds and hundreds of people there. But the key moment was when Guy Rowland, Rory, and I laid the wreath for the 155 Canadians that were killed in 166 Squadron. And the British really know how to do it. They've got all these flags, they've got all these people in uniform. We represented Canada. Air Chief Marshal Sir Michael Graydon of the Royal Air Force represented the United Kingdom, but the Lord Lieutenant of the Shire was there, all of the local officials, the Member of Parliament, hundreds of people. It was really quite something. But when we laid the wreath, they dipped all the flags, so they touched the ground. They played the Canadian national anthem, and it was the most moving experience. At that moment, I decided I have got to learn what Bomber Command did, and I've got to do something about it. It was born at that moment when we laid that wreath and they played our magnificent national anthem for these 155 Canadian airmen. So I wrote the book, and the biggest publishers in Britain for all of this stuff did something they've never done before, and they'll probably never do again. They said I have such an unusual writing style that it was pointless for them to change a single word. From the first word of the introduction to the last word of the conclusion, they didn't change a single word. However, being British, they said, but you got to get rid of 40,000 words. They didn't care which words, but 40,000 had to go. So my ever helpful wife wiped out 30,000 words in about 3 days in editing the book. It was a bit of a massacre. Roddy MacKenzie, and every time this stuff went out, she would say to me, you know, these are magnificent words, Roddy. They really are. They belong in a book, but not in this book. So we got the 40,000 words down. They published it on the 15th of January, 2023. By November, it was sold out. So the second edition came out in 2024, and the book's been extremely well received. I've been talking now all across Canada about Bomber Command. In Calgary, they made me the esteemed historian for the huge speech on Remembrance Day, etc. Various other cities were really quite remarkable. In Toronto, people paid, I think it was $400 a plate to listen to a speech. No, $300 a plate, and there were 400 of them that showed up for the aviation national meeting for the Hall of Fame. But it was all about me speaking in Bomber Command. But the most powerful one, who would have ever thought, was in Montreal. I was at Place des Arts, you know, the heart of secular Montreal's culture and all of that. The place was sold out. There were 2,600 people there. The whole symphony orchestra was behind me, and they wanted somebody to speak about Bomber Command. They wanted to speak about the war. But I was asked, and when I agreed, I thought the speech was in Vancouver. I didn't know it was in Montreal. And then they didn't tell me until 4 days before I spoke in Montreal that 1/3 of the speech had to be in French. Well, my 8 years of studying French in Alberta meant that I really could hardly even order a meal in a restaurant. But I worked on it, et cetera, and I went on there, and I got onto the stage. It was a totally empty stage, and the organizers had fallen behind time. So they asked if I would just condense my speech to simply introducing the air cadets that were coming in. Well, that really aroused my anger. So as I walked to the microphone, I thought, what am I going to do when I get to this microphone? I've got 2,600 people here, every seat filled. I've got nobody else on this stage except the symphony orchestra, and I've got the microphone. Well, I gave them a speech. It was a barn burner of a speech. The microphones worked, but I don't think they needed them. I think I shouted most of it, and 1/3 of it in French. I just went back and forth. And then there was this dead silence, so the bagpipes started up to bring in the air cadets, and then there was this explosion of applause. Bagpipes were totally dried out, so they simply stopped playing. They were so emotionally involved. It was the most emotionally powerful audience ever, and it was almost all Francophone. And tears on people's eyes. I've never forgotten that. Canadians have an incredibly powerful reaction once they become aware of what it was. And that brings us to our king. The one group that always supported Bomber Command, start to finish, through the war, after the war, was the royal family. The Queen Mother was the great patron of Bomber Command, and she was a real force to be reckoned with. But all of them, when they had that monument finally open on the 28th of June of 2012, at the best location in London, in Green Park, right across from the Royal Air Force Club, right across behind it, Buckingham Palace. Not one single government official showed up. Not one penny of government money went into it. Not one politician showed up. Several thousand bomber boys and their families showed up, and so did Queen Elizabeth. And Queen Elizabeth brought 23 members of the royal family to that. 23 members. She had Prince Philip in his Air Force uniform. She had Prince Charles in his. She had Prince William in his, etc. She brought 23, and she personally unveiled it. So I felt it was so important the royal family be aware of the book. The problem is none of us, the royal family cannot receive a present from any of us. They can't receive presents from anyone that is a private citizen that isn't a personal friend. So what do? I sent an email to the RAF with my predicament, and 45 minutes later, I got a reply directly from Air Chief Marshal Sir Rich Knighton, who is the current commanding officer of the Royal Air Force, saying, "I will present your book to the King." Well, it was an elaborate process. I had to come to England, did up special letters. It's a very elaborate process. It's not simple. But in due course, the commanding officer of the Royal Air Force went to Buckingham Palace, and in a formal audience, for the first time in the history of the RAF, formal audience with the King for the sole purpose of giving him a book. And he presented my book to the King. He made a lovely speech. He gave one to Prince William. He gave one to Prince Charles. I'm sorry, he gave one to Prince Edward. And he also gave one to the Princess Royal, Princess Anne. And as I mentioned, the Royal Air Force made me a member of the club. And the British have now made me their Bomber Command ambassador. But it doesn't end there. The next thing that happened was I got this amazing letter from Buckingham Palace. I mean, this was really quite the letter. It was several months later, and it said, "Dear Mr. Mackenzie, the King has asked me to thank you for his most generous gift of a copy of your book entitled Bomber Command, Churchill's Greatest Triumph, which you very kindly sent to His Majesty. Your extremely thoughtful gesture is greatly appreciated, and the King has asked me to convey his warmest gratitude and very best wishes to you." And it's signed by the head of royal correspondence. Air Chief Michael Graydon said, "There's actually no greater honor." And it led directly to me getting the King Charles Coronation Medal. It led direct, and that was really interesting too, because I have in our riding a Liberal member of Parliament. I'd gotten the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal through the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada, but our member of Parliament was a member of the Conservatives. So the Liberals were approached evidently by people who wanted to nominate me, and they were very polite about it, but nothing happened. There wasn't a strong level of interest in Bomber Command. And so the British, Royal Commonwealth Society came in. The national president came in and put on a huge ceremony. They're authorized by Canada to issue the thing, and Senator Jonah Martin participated. She's the only Korean Canadian senator, and my wife is of Korean background as well. It was an incredible evening, incredible performance, etc., etc. But then this last Thursday, I got a call from this Liberal member of Parliament. They had now decided they wanted to give this medal to me after all, and the ceremony was going to be on the Friday night. So I explained that I already had the medal, but I went Friday night as their guest, and it was all very, very nice. This is just 3 days ago. So what happened? What happened between when the Liberals were first approached, and they weren't really very excited about Bomber Command, to what happened this weekend, is the Liberal Party of Canada has really done a 180-degree flip regarding the Canadian Armed Forces. And so rather than not really wanting to do much of anything with our armed forces, suddenly they're front and center. And I'm sort of the poster boy for exactly how all of that happened. And that just happened in the last 3 days. So what was Bomber Command? It was the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth at that time had 6 members. They had one of them, Ireland was neutral in the war. South Africa was tied down with the South African War. It left 4 countries. So on the 17th of December, 1939, and you'll recall that was the birthday of William Lyon Mackenzie King. It was on his birthday, 17th of December, all 4 nations in Ottawa signed the agreement that created the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, which the British sometimes call the Imperial Air Training Plan. But at any rate, they created this air training plan because, as I say, Mackenzie King and Churchill were convinced The only way we're going to win this war is if we control the air, and the only way we're going to control the air is if we have the best air crew that the world has ever seen. That's the only way this can happen. So the four countries signed the agreement, and we put in we had to finance this thing. Australia contributed $68 million. This is 1939 dollars. Australia put in $68 million for this plan. The United Kingdom gave us $54 million plus $162 million in used equipment. That's what they valued it at. You have to have planes in order to keep people fly. And New Zealand, with just under 1 million people, New Zealand sent $48 million. $48 million to finance this plan. So what did Canada do? Canada contributed $1.6 billion from 11 million Canadians who had just come out of the Great Depression. I think every mattress in the country got cleaned out. People didn't have a lot of confidence in banks, but they did have confidence in the government, and they had confidence in Mackenzie King that every cent would be well spent. They shelled out $1.6 billion. We had to build runways for, we had to have places to train these guys, and they had to have runways that we could teach them how to fly. And so Royal Canadian Air Force had 100,000 people employed in running this whole thing. They had 120 flying schools in 200 locations, and they all needed runways. We made the runways extra wide and extra long, so these kids had half a chance of finding them and actually landing without getting themselves killed. Just to build the runways, we used enough asphalt. We could have built a 2-lane highway from Ottawa to Vancouver. $1.6 billion, and we could have built a 2-lane highway from Ottawa to Vancouver. So what did we get for that? We got 131,553 of the world's finest aircrew. So then we go to 1943. 1943 changed everything. You'll recall up until key battles in 42, we were losing virtually every battle we were in. Everything was going wrong in World War II. It's just one disaster after another. And that brought us to January of 43. The Bomber Group 6, the Royal Canadian Air Force, had come into existence in October of 1942, and now we're trying to organize our planes and our people. They'd given us Halifaxes when we wanted Lancasters. They'd given us Wellingtons, which are just a death trap in a bomber raid. And we're trying to make some sense out of all of this. And so on the 23rd of January, 1943, the Royal Canadian Air Force, as a completely separate air force, bombed Nazi Germany for the first time. 4 days later, on the 27th of January, the American Bomber Command bombed Germany, also for the very first time. How many people know that we bombed Germany 4 days before they did? This meant that the Luftwaffe now had to deal with 3 very different air forces, rather than just the RAF. 2 huge surprises I had in my research are, first of all, the Americans were infinitely closer to us than I could have imagined. They put their headquarters in the same little village as Sir Arthur Harris. He and Ira Eaker met every day of the week to review what they were doing. We had all kinds of combined missions and everything. And Ira Eaker was very clear. They were the little brother. The Americans were the little brother of Bomber Command. We had better planes, especially the Lancaster. We had better bombs, especially the Grand Slams and the Tall Boys. We had better air crew, and we had infinitely better navigation equipment than they did. But we were really close. My other huge surprise was the Royal Canadian Air Force was totally independent. It was a Canadian operation, start to finish. And all that we were involved in with the High Command was which bombing raids we would do on our own and which ones we would do as part of combined forces. And in my book, I describe that in every raid that I'm talking about, every sortie, that it had X number of RCF bombers, X number of UK bombers, and X number of American bombers, etc. when it was multi-force. So why was it controversial? Why was Bomber Command so controversial? If you had to say in a single word, the word is Dresden. In fact, people have actually said that Dresden was comparable to the Holocaust. pretty much everything you've ever heard about Dresden is wrong. And you know who set me straight on Dresden? Who set me straight on Dresden was the Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel. 2015, she's doing a remembrance on Dresden, and she said, you know, there were only 20,000 people killed in Dresden. Goebbels added a zero and made it 200,000. And Allies actually believe what Goebbels said. She said, you know, the Institute of German history, that military history that I rely on, they say that Bomber Command Dresden, the story of Dresden is buried in a mountain of myths and outright barefaced lies. So the casualties were about 20,000. Those were the two biggest lies Goebbels told in the war. He added a zero, 20,000 became 200,000. And secondly, he said it had no military value when it was three of the most important railway lines, marshalling arts in the entire country. They had 150 war worker factories. They had about 50,000 soldiers in the city at that point because the Russians were only 70 miles away. And this is where they're preparing the defenses. It was a major military target. And it became a three-country operation. What happened was Yalta, Stalin asked for Dresden, pointed out that, you know, the Bomber Command was so effective for D-Day and so effective for Britain and Canada in Battle of Normandy and so effective for the Americans in getting across the Rhine River, etc. Well, now the Red Army was seriously overextended. It was only 70 miles away, and we needed to knock out their communications and everything. Stalin asked for the bombing. Churchill and Roosevelt ordered the bombing. And on that result, 719 British bombers, 527 American bombers, and 77 Canadian bombers bombed Dresden. Now, 10 of the RCAF bombers were Pathfinders. This three Air Force joint attack was a huge success. It enabled the Red Army to proceed to Berlin. The British cabinet had a report that if we didn't help the Russians the same way we were helping ourselves, the war would go on for another 2 years. Instead, we all know that it ended that April. So the other thing was accuracy. I tell a couple of fast stories on accuracy because the idea was Bomber Command just bombed everything everywhere. They just dropped bombs all over the place. In fact, the worst moment in the history of the CBC and the National Film Board was in January of 1992 when they had the Valor and the Horror series and they did Death by Midnight, Death by Moonlight. That was the most inaccurate statement of Bomber Command imaginable. They had us, the McKenna brothers had us believing that all we did was bomb irrelevant cities full of women and children because we like killing people. That's essentially what they were saying. Afterwards, the Senate had a complete inquiry into that, and the Senate said, even though the McKenna brothers were entitled to their opinion as broadcasters, there wasn't one scintilla of evidence to support what these people were saying. So on the issue of accuracy, first of all, we have the famous Norden bomb site, you know, of the Americans. It was supposed to be able to drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 30,000 feet. That was the idea. Well, it didn't work quite like that. The Mighty Eighth had probably the worst day of their entire time in the World War II on March 4th, 1945, where it was so bad that when the I'm sorry, I'm getting my dates mixed up here. It was the 17th of April, 1943. Curtis LeMay was part of 230 American bombers, and they were dropping these things using the Norden bomb site. And the Americans thought if they knocked out these ball bearing factories that the Germans would surrender. So they had 230 American bombers dropping 2,000 bombs on these two factories. And of 2,000 bombs using this wonderful bomb site, only 80 bombs hit the target and none of them did very much damage. Meanwhile, America lost 60 bombers and 552 airmen captured or killed. It was the worst catastrophe in the history of, well, it wasn't even an Air Force in those days. The Air Force came into existence in 1947. It was the worst catastrophe of the Americans in the air ever. Then Curtis LeMay was sent over to Japan, and by that point he couldn't care less about precision bombing or whatever. He Harvard had just invented napalm. He got napalm into these B-29s, and he blasted 67 cities in Germany, in Japan. But everybody starts thinking Bomber Command was doing that sort of thing, and it wasn't. I'm running into a real problem here because you kind of wanted me to stop speaking about 11:15, and I think it's about 11:15. So I'm not just too sure. Should I just spend like a fast 2 minutes just saying exactly what the Germans said and just leave it at that? Probably that's what I should do.
Our president says take go another 10 minutes or so.
Okay. Because this accuracy is really, really important. So the other accuracy story involves Jimmy Stewart. Now, he's one of America's most beloved actors, and he plays a huge role in my book because the Americans play a huge role in my book, and he's the key guy. He was a master bomber of up to 150 bombers in the air. Anyways, he had to chair a court-martial in June of 1945 because a bunch of their Liberator bombers, we always had targets. And my dad, evidently, according to his citation, always hit the target. But the Americans, they look for, because they're doing it daylight, targets of opportunity. You get to the city, you look out the window and think, well, where should I drop my bomb? That's what they were doing. So anyways, they were doing this, and this was on the 4th of March, 45. So this is almost the end of the war. So this is when their navigation, everything is at best. Yeah, this is the city. So they just stopped dropping bombs. Well, first of all, they had the wrong city. Secondly, they had the wrong country. They thought they were bombing Freiburg in Germany, when in fact they were bombing Zurich in Switzerland. So they have a full board of inquiry court-martial chaired by Jimmy Stewart, and this is what the court said. This is what the biographer of Jimmy Stewart's biography says. The circumstances were all too familiar to Jimmy. Bad weather, inoperative navigation equipment, and misidentification of terrain by the lead navigator, who was convinced he was over Freiburg, Germany, and the formation looked for a target of opportunity. And accordingly, everybody was acquitted. That's how bad their accuracy was. Our accuracy, meanwhile, on the 25th of April 45, when our bombers, including my dad's squadron, bombed Birch's Garden to wipe the whole place out so it wouldn't become some kind of a last stand of the Nazis or a shrine to Adolf Hitler. This girl describes it, and this is how she describes it. On a deceptively clear morning, April 25, 45, like a final thunderclap after a violent storm, British warplanes came swooping into the valley. The hellish explosions were followed by an explosion, storm-like wind that would have blown me off my feet if I hadn't gripped the rough bark of the nearest spruce and pressed myself against it. The earth shook. The air was filled with the rumble of airplane motors, the whistle of falling bombs, the detonation, and the wind that followed. We fully expected the entire valley had been destroyed. Yet when it was finally over, we found out the bombs had destroyed the Nazi settlement over the mountain, but left our village and the entire valley untouched. So that's their deal. I'm going to quickly, because it's a single sentence, I'm going to tell you about Bomber Command War at Sea. Some people have said Bomber Command at Sea sunk a single submarine. That's all they did. But this is what they in fact did. This is a single sentence. My research revealed that Bomber Command sunk or disabled 8 of the 19 warships in Germany's high seas fleet, destroyed a third of Germany's U-boats at their bases, destroyed Germany's light surface naval force in the English Channel, largely through the Royal Canadian Air Force laying mines, sunk or damaged 1,000 ships of the German merchant marine, and blockaded every port from the Bay of Biscay in southern France. And as a result of this, 40% of German naval personnel were forced by Bomber Command to work full-time on mine sweeping, complements of the RCAF. That was what they did there. So what did the Germans say? Adolf Hitler, let's start with Hitler. Hitler said just days before his suicide, he said to his foreign minister von Ribbentrop, the real cause of Germany's defeat was the failure of the German Air Force. That's Adolf Hitler. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel said to Hitler face to face, if you can't stop the bombing, we can't win the war. And then I've got a whole list of leaders here, and they're all saying the same thing. But the one we should listen to is Albert Speer, because as the Minister of Armaments and War Production, he's the one that had to replace everything. We kept blowing up. This is what Albert Speer said. He said, Germany's failure to defeat Bomber Command was Germany's greatest lost battle of the whole war. The strategic bombing offensive did more damage to the German war effort than losing every battle in Russia, including the surrender of Stalingrad, because bombing continually damaged with ever-increasing ferocity and ultimately destroyed Germany's ability to produce the means necessary to make war. How's that for total clarity? And just one quick moment, what do the Allies say? Here's General Eisenhower. General Eisenhower wrote to General Marshall, Bomber Command is the most effective part of our entire organization. It's always seeking and finding new ways for their particular type of aircraft to be of assistance. Eisenhower also told Marshall that Sir Arthur Harris not only willingly supports the ground operation, but he actually proved to be one of the most respected and cooperative members of the entire team. What about Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, who's not known for idle compliments? Montgomery said about Sir Arthur Harris, "I doubt whether any single man did more in winning the war than he did. I doubt whether any single man did more in winning the war than he did." And then Eisenhower, as president, I think summed it up perfectly when he wrote to Harris, "A special word of thanks to you for your skill and selfless dedication to the cause in which we all serve. No historian could possibly be aware of the depth of my obligation to you." And so that's Bomber Command we must remember. Thank you.
Okay. Dennis or Kirk, you could turn the lights on at the back. And Herbie said time for, if there are any questions, what I'd like to ask you to do, if you have a question for Roddy, I'd like to ask you to come up to the microphone here. That way Roddy can see you better. Any questions, folks? While you're thinking about that, Roddy, you mentioned you're in West Vancouver. My wife was born in North Vancouver. Her mother grew up in West Van, and my wife's uncle, surname was Hailstone, was killed in a bomber in the Second War. The plane went down in Ireland, I think it was on a training flight. There's a little memorial park right across from the library on Marine Drive in West Van.
Yes, there is. Yes, there is. That's our war memorial.
Yeah, my wife's uncle's name is on one of the, is carved, it's chiseled in there.
Okay, I'll have a look.
Surname was,
that's only 2 blocks. That's only 2 blocks from where I live.
Yeah, my mother-in-law used to live at the Kiwanis, the place right behind the community center on Gordon.
Yes, between 21st and 22nd. I'm on Argyle, the street by the water on 21st, 22nd. Yeah. So I'm about 3.5 blocks, 3.5 blocks from your mother-in-law.
Yeah. Any questions, folks? If not, Duncan, I think you're doing the thank you. Thanks, Roddy. The technology worked okay. We could hear you just fine.
Good. Thank you.
Oh, I can turn off the recording now. I really rely on Russ to do this, and that's why, Roddy, the thing you heard partway through is I remembered I was supposed to be recording. Russ usually does that from offsite. How do I stop?